What does it mean to be excommunicated?
Why is it Archbishop Vigano's place to arrive at the conclusion that Pope Francis needs to resign?
Like, it seems like this justice is selective. And when you have selective justice, it's actually not justice at all. Father Cristino, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
Question for you on Archbishop Vigano. He was excommunicated. Before we get into maybe his specific case or a little bit about his life, we might touch on that. What does it mean to be excommunicated?
Well, technically, to be excommunicated means to be put outside of the communion of the church. So it's a formal declaration that you have been found guilty of something that has required you to be put outside of the visible communion of the church. So if I wanted to use a very simplistic example, maybe I'd say it's an analogy of going on a timeout. You're at dinner with all of your children and someone misbehaves and you say, you can't stay at the table. If you're going to behave like that, go to your room. And so your child goes and sits in her room and she feels terrible and you can hear her crying. And so you go to the door and ask her, do you know why I sent you to your room? And if she can say, yes, I shouldn't have been poking my sister with a fork. And I know that's wrong and I'm sorry that I did that. Okay, so are you not going to do that anymore? Then you can restore her to the table and she can come back. Maybe she just needed that time to cool down. If you had ignored it and just let it go, perhaps it would have gotten worse. Maybe she would have upgraded her utensil or something. But if you just kick her out of the family and send her packing and good luck and hope you don't get taken by a pack of wolves, that seems a bit extreme, right? So excommunication is really an act of mercy. It's a way of saying, how can I make sure that we wake you up to where you've gone wrong so that you can be restored to the table, so that you can become one with the family again.
So is it correct to say that when one is excommunicated, they are in one sense outside the family?
Oh yes, I mean, but by analogy, with the same way that your child is outside the family when they've been dismissed from the table. They don't cease to be part of your family. They don't cease to bear the Yazinski name because they can be restored in an instant. And that's the same with an excommunicated person, that they can be restored to the full communion of the church. But for a period of time, they now must bear the consequences of being outside of that, which generally, I mean, practically it plays out in not being able to access the sacraments.
It seems to me, though, also a very serious thing, not to be taken lightly.
Absolutely.
Because we're talking about the church is the way that we obtain salvation through the church.
Right.
So when we're saying you're outside of the church, this is a quite serious thing when we're talking about salvation, and eternal life or eternal damnation.
Now, I will point out to you from history,
Yeah.
Saint Joan of Arc died excommunicated from the church. At the time of her execution, she also had been excommunicated by her bishop. Now we've canonized her as a saint. So an excommunication is not an automatic decree binding on God's judgment. So it's not as though it bears that level of significance. It's for this life to awake you to the fact that if you do not change, if something about you is not reformed, then your salvation is at risk. But it's not at risk because the church has done this to you. And that's what needs to be clarified. You mentioned at the beginning, I presume we're going to talk more about Archbishop Viganò. His situation is different in that he was informed that he had excommunicated himself. And that's the difference here, that he incurred something that is referred to in canon law as a late sententiae excommunication, which means that the act itself excommunicated him. And so this is a declaration making publicly known to him and others that this has been judged to have occurred, which is different than a different kind of excommunication, which is imposed upon a person as a penalty for something that did not automatically do that to yourself, but it has been imposed for the sake of deriving the same outcome, your conversion and your repentance, and then your restoration to the fullness of communion with the church. In Archbishop Vigano's case, and in others who have incurred such an excommunication, it's the thing itself that has excommunicated you, not the judgment of the church.
Okay. So for those people who follow Catholic church life online, Archbishop Vigano came to our awareness. I mean, he was in the church for a long time, but he came to the forefront because of the situations around McCarrick. And I thought I'd turn it over to you and just walk us through the series of events and how he first came to our consciousness for most people.
Sure, I should give the caveat that there might be some gaps in my recollection about how things unfolded, but he was a very prominent churchman for a long time. For a period of time, he held a position in the Vatican, Secretariat of State, known as the Sostituto, which is the second in command. So after the Secretary of State, the Cardinal Secretary of State, it was him. And he was extremely trusted by Pope Benedict XVI. And so he went from that role where, as he claims, he began to unearth financial malfeasance in the Vatican and started to ask difficult questions and begin to make some enemies to himself. He was removed from that position, which was regarded as a reprimand of sorts, though it would become clear later that Benedict XVI actually said, now I really know I can trust you, but we have issues in the United States that need to be addressed. And therefore he dispatched him to be his envoy, his ambassador, which we refer to in the church as a nuncio, as the nuncio, apostolic nuncio to the United States of America. So technically that could and should normally, under normal circumstances, look like a downgrade, like a demotion. Mm-hmm. But it seems to have been with the understanding that he was going to be one of the few people that Pope Benedict could trust to deal with some issues that he was becoming aware of that were taking place in the US. Among those, Vigano would later suggest, were dealing with high-ranking clergy, such as someone as very high-ranking as Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the Archbishop Emeritus of Washington, D.C., being guilty of sexual abuse of minors and all other manner of the evil that is now known to have been committed by him. Mm-hmm. So when he went and was doing that work, it sounds as though during the period of time when he remained the nuncio in that country, he tried to just contain McCarrick on behalf of Benedict XVI. Then Benedict resigned, replaced by Francis. Vigano claimed that he informed Pope Francis of all of this backstory. And nevertheless, Pope Francis apparently rehabilitated McCarrick from the life of hiddenness and silence that Benedict had relegated him to, and gave him new responsibilities in the church, primarily dealing with the Chinese Communist Party and working on a deal with them about what the Vatican would do to work in conjunction with the Chinese government to try and regularize the situation of the Catholic Church in China. It's a very prominent profile, yes. If in fact it was what happened. That, I think, is still debated. Nevertheless, that's how things went, and McCarrick sort of, it seems, touted himself as having been rehabilitated by the Pope, and sounding also like he had been a champion of Francis, of Cardinal Bergoglio, to be elected as Pope in the first place. Mm-hmm. So some questionable things allegedly going on there. And in 2018, when the statute of limitations in the state of New York had been lifted, meaning that they could explore and investigate historic allegations of any kind of criminal nature, were brought against the Catholic Church, and meaning that historic allegations of sexual abuse could now be investigated that were older than a certain period of time. Cardinal Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, was made aware that such allegations existed against Cardinal McCarrick, who at that time serving as an auxiliary bishop in New York and eventually a bishop in New Jersey and a cardinal and then Archbishop of Washington, D.C. He needed to investigate these, and they were found to be credible allegations. That's when this became public news. A cardinal of the church credibly accused of sexual abuse. And then Vigano emerges from out of the shadows. He retired. He was no longer the nuncio in the United States. And he publishes this very long testimonial in which he denounces Cardinal McCarrick, says that this was already known, this was already decidedly not dealt with, that Pope Benedict tried to deal with it in this way, and Pope Francis had reversed that and undermined him and knowingly rehabilitated the sexual abuser, and he even called for, at that time, Pope Francis to resign as a consequence of all of this now coming to the surface.
And this was also done in the backdrop with the Pennsylvania grand jury report around, I think, earlier, but this was all fresh in people's memory as well.
That's right. So the clergy sexual abuse crisis, it seemed like, was yet again being reinvigorated and brought to the forefront, except now, as opposed to what almost always seemed to happen when something like this came to light, you had this sort of wall of the bishops standing arm in arm, very apologetic, but absolutely committed to eradicating this rot from the life of the church. Now it looked like there was one of them pointing the finger back at them this time.
Yeah.
And not just anyone, right? Not just the auxiliary bishop of Timbuktu, but the former nuncio to the United States of America, who absolutely would know all of the details about all of this, these goings on, and the second highest ranking official in the Vatican for a period of time leading up to that. So his prominence lent itself automatically to credibility. And I think that's why it was difficult to look away from what he was saying or just disregard it. Since that time...
Well, I just comment on that. Like,
Sure.
that first letter, the second letter, I remember reading them. I think I even read them and put them on the channel. And I think many people, like myself, generally appreciated very much what he did. Mm-hmm. Because there was just like a sense of like something rotten is going on in the church and no one is saying anything, and there's secrets here, and it's like this well-known secret that no one talks about. And all of a sudden, he was perceived by many as a champion, coming out and saying, look, things are not what they seem, and here it all is. And obviously I appreciated his letters, particularly his first two, because it really caught my attention. I think many people like myself were disillusioned with the church and how the handling of sexual abuse within the church and minors, and the James Grimes story, and to him to come out, it was like maybe something's going to be done. And I think what he did this was really the downfall of McCarrick shortly after this. I think it really did contribute to how it ended up for him. Mm-hmm. So I think many people, like myself, look at that period of time and appreciate the work that he did. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but many people. But then as time started going on, for myself, I'm like, something's not... He got more political. Yeah. And it just didn't have the same resonance with me, and I didn't quite understand where this was all going. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts?
I don't disagree with the relief that it brought to hear someone from within the church sounding the alarm. It was reassuring to feel like, okay, we're not just some old boys club who circle the wagons and do everything in our power to protect ourselves. Because we keep saying we're not that, and then it somehow just keeps feeling like that's what we keep doing.
Yeah.
And so it was reassuring that there are some who weren't willing to do that. When you're just a a lowly parish priest, or as I was at the time, the vocation director of a diocese in Western Canada, you feel very helpless in the grand scheme of things with regard to the life of the church. It's easy for me to say to myself, well, if I was a cardinal archbishop, that's not how I would be handling things. But that's useless thought. I mean, who cares what I would be doing if I was in a situation that I clearly am not right now? So that means nothing. But to then have someone of his prominence actually step up and do something, it did feel, in a twisted kind of way, it felt good. It was like, okay, maybe we're just going to lance the boil here, and all the pus just needs to get out, and we need to face this. And that initial reaction, I think, is well founded. But even from that first letter, there was a line of misguidance that seems to have just always been tracing its way through Archbishop Vigano's actions and ways of thinking, because even if all he was doing was testifying to the truth of the situation, and that it was absolutely the truth that he had warned Pope Francis ignored him and rehabilitated McCarrick to have this new and prominent role, even if all of that was true, why is it Archbishop Vigano's place to arrive at the conclusion that Pope Francis needs to resign? The point of being the head of the institutional church, of being the supreme, immediate, absolute monarch, if you will, is that you don't answer to anyone. There are reasons why that being true can wreak havoc, but if the alternative is to just not let that be true anymore, and who's going to change that? That is what we have inherited. That is part and parcel of the papacy. And so then to have a retired archbishop then say, and now Pope Francis, you need to resign, that already for me was like, that's not your place to say that. If that is true, maybe you should fly to Rome and have a private meeting with him and say, Holy Father, I don't know how you can justify continuing on in your office with this black spot against you. That would be appropriate, because now as a bishop, you're talking to the head of the College of Bishops and trying to collegially work with him, and Pope Francis claims to be very collegial and open to that. But that's not what he did. And so that was, to me, already the first sign of a red flag. Like, it was all going along well, and you were saying the things that I think needed to be said, and then this little extra curveball gets thrown in there. And I think that's what I've just continuously watched with Vigano. Even if you would say that it's the logical conclusion that if Pope Francis was guilty of these things, then he ought to resign, what is to be gained by just saying that? It's just an opinion. And it's an opinion that can't be enforced. But you've made it publicly, and I think it was counterproductive. And so that, you already alluded to the fact that over time, more and more, you've just started to see Vigano kind of trail into points of politics and confusion that haven't resonated with you.
Yeah.
And now here we see it has reached an apex. My point to that is, I think we've been watching this slow progression over the last 6 years, and that it has arrived at this moment is not surprising.
Yeah, I feel it's sad. One thing I wonder, there was always this need to be hidden and never in public and in secret. And I don't know if he has friends around him or not, but this is the public perception is that he was disconnected. Maybe then that's not true. Maybe he is very well connected with the community, people around him. I just know that if one is by themselves, and I know when I'm by myself and I'm not talking to other people, my mind goes pretty negative pretty quick. That's my tendency. I get pessimistic. The glass is half empty rather than half full, and it's because someone else drank it and enjoyed it. These are my tendencies that I have to be aware of. So it was just and again, I probably it was for safety reasons that I think he said, but you get to the point where I believe he just simply rejected the authority of the Pope. I think there was this inching towards more inflammatory language against Pope Francis that I don't think was very helpful. It didn't seem respectful. There's a difference between, and we've spoken about this before, about being in disagreement with someone, but then in the way that you disagree is disrespectful. And I felt like that's what I was seeing, and that's why I kind of tuned out a little bit.
Yeah.
But then you got to the point where he just simply rejected the authority of Pope Francis. That and his authority, isn't that what gets somebody? They excommunicate themselves when they no longer accept the authority of the Pope.
Yes, I mean, he doesn't not accept the authority of the Pope. He believes that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is not the Pope, that we don't have a Pope now. And what I think is especially problematic about, I want to be very careful about how I say this. There are varieties of ways in which people have argued that point, what you would generally refer to as Jorge Mario Bergoglio being an anti-pope, meaning simply not objectively possessing the Petrine office of the See of Rome, even though it appears that he is. And we've had, 30 some anti-popes in the history of the church. And it's almost always happened around disputes regarding who was allowed to participate in an election and who ended up being elected. So this isn't a novel phenomenon. It's happened multiple times. In this case, you can argue for that to be true now, and I want to clarify, I am not arguing that that is true. I believe that Pope Francis is the legitimate Roman pontiff of the Catholic Church. When you argue it in one way or another, you have to make sure that your argument is coherent. And I think some of the arguments that are put forward have the capacity to be more coherent than others. And Archbishop Vigano's, I find completely incoherent. And that's what surprises me about a man of his intelligence and stature and history and experience in working in the life of the church, to have arrived at the conclusion that he has the way that he has. If you're solving a complex math problem and you get the wrong answer, that's no surprise. But if the part you get wrong is the simple one-digit addition at the beginning, I think it's a bit shocking that you got some of the trigonometry correct, but you didn't know how to do the addition. It seems to me that his whole argument around why this is true just already doesn't make sense, which I think calls into question what all is going on here, and are there other extenuating circumstances in his mental or emotional health? As you pointed out, maybe living all of this time in seclusion has done something to him. Maybe he's not well. He's 83 years old. Maybe he's not thinking clearly or straight anymore. But if he wanted to arrive at the conclusion that he has, there are coherent ways that I would still disagree with, but that he could have arrived at than he has. And that's part of what I find surprising. But to add complexity to this already complex story, that is what is being said has caused him to be excommunicated latae sententiae. That he no longer believes in the identity of Jorge Bergoglio as Pope Francis. Therefore, he is automatically excommunicated. What I can't understand is the selective nature in going after this person who has precipitously undermined his credibility from where he started to where he is now, as a now 83-year-old man who is living in hiding, to have focused their aim on him and excommunicate him, while there are others who still enjoy public platforms that say that sort of thing, and it's been silent, it's confusing.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it just opens up a whole other conversation, which is, how is justice meted out by our current Vatican? And it's just not clear to me that is done with consistency.
I believe Bishop Athanasius Schneider said that it would have been better for him not to be excommunicated, although he agreed that his actions were not correct. He wasn't supporting Vigano's actions, but he's like, what good will come from this? And I think that sentiment, I think there's many people within the church that are frustrated that he was excommunicated because they perceive justice falling upon him quickly and swiftly. But then there's other groups, as you pointed out, in the church that say things that are contrary to the faith, and I will mention like the bishops of Germany, seeming to be on their own path, on their own synodal path. You know, Vigano, you could say he was on his own path. The bishops of Germany, seems that in some ways they are on their own path too. And then nothing really is done. A little slap on the wrist, oh, you can't do that. But nothing more significant than that. So people perceive that, or you could talk about Bishop Strickland, where I've heard canon lawyers say there was a great miscarriage of justice there because the church, the laws of the church were not followed. Canon law wasn't followed. I'm not a canon lawyer, but I'm just hearing people say this. And so they point out to Strickland, and they point to the German bishops, and then they look at Vigano, and like, it seems like this justice is selective. And when you have selective justice, it's actually not justice at all. That's the argument. And that's, I think, I don't know how common that perception is, but it's definitely not small.
Right.
And it fuels great frustration amongst the Catholic faithful. And there's a great agitation about this. What do you say to those Catholics who are like greatly troubled by that? And it just seems that's what I'm a little agitated by that. I'm not saying what Vigano did is right, but it just seems like there's a selective justice within the church. Yeah.
And I think why that's dangerous is not just because of the mixed up perceptions that it causes in the minds and the hearts of some of the faithful. It's not just about perceptions. It's about objective reality. And to what extent, then, is the credibility of the church as an institution undermined when she doesn't seem to carry out justice equitably at all? If that's what's happening, to say, well, Vigano needs to be excommunicated because he doesn't think that Pope Francis is Pope. What are the implications of not thinking that he's the Pope? As far as I can tell, the only thing that causes him is that when he says Mass, he doesn't say his name. That's the thing that I think is the only thing that is the consequence of Archbishop Viganò at this time. He's a retired 83-year-old who doesn't enjoy any office in the church. You have the German bishops who have been criticized, challenged, reprimanded, corrected by the Pope, contradicting him to his face. What's the difference? They say, we believe you're the Pope, but we will disobey you and ignore you and mock you publicly, but nothing happens there. And then you have another person who says, I'm not mocking you, I just don't believe you're the Pope. And you will be excommunicated. It causes one to question the rationale that is used to apply the justice. If what is needing to be preserved, and I believe it needs to be preserved, is the respect for the office of Peter, the vicar of Christ, which means submitting oneself to his authority. This person doesn't submit himself to your authority because he doesn't think you have the authority. This person doesn't submit himself to your authority because he doesn't want to. Those are different, but it's the same outcome. And if the outcome is what's being protected against, then that's problematic. Now, the argument can be made that, well, the Holy Father is taking a different course of action with them. And so he's seeking to correct them in a different way. I actually do believe that that's what he's trying to do. So that's fine. He's the Pope, let him do that. But when the confusion ensues because of what appears to be selective, it doesn't mean that your own credibility doesn't get undermined. And maybe they don't care. Maybe at the Vatican they say, who cares? It's a handful of Catholics that get disgruntled about everything under the sun anyhow, so there's no pleasing them anyway. I don't care if they're confused. That might be the way that they think, and that's fine. Okay, then those in authority have to make decisions about things all the time that aren't necessarily going to be popular or well received. So I think that that's legitimate. But when things are handled in a public way, they wouldn't be if it wasn't perceived to bring about a public positive impact. And I guess that's what I'm asking, is what is the perceived public positive impact that's taken from this course of action over here that isn't taken over there?
I suppose one side could say, well, the one positive public action that results from this is that it puts a warning flag for people to stop following what Vigano is saying. Mm-hmm. I think it's just dangerous, in my opinion, to follow somebody and hang on every word when they no longer recognize the Pope as the Pope. Mm-hmm. That's a red flag.
Right.
I don't read those people usually, out of curiosity, what is he saying? But I mean, I don't go to him.
And so the question is, do those people who follow him already believe that?
Yeah.
And if they do, I wonder then, are we applying the necessary medicine to all the right places? To take this back to McCarrick, I've wondered this for a long time. Why was he laicized and expelled from the College of Cardinals through a canonical procedure instead of being excommunicated? Why wasn't Bishop Strickland excommunicated as opposed to just being deposed from his office? Father Frank Pavone, laicized, but not excommunicated. How is it being arrived at that removing you from your office because of your behavior is actually more effective than saying, because of your behavior, you have put yourself outside of the communion of the church? And if it's that their behavior hasn't put them outside of the communion of the church, then is losing their office a suitable remedy for the problem? And I think that where that doesn't look like it happens consistently that's just what generates that sense of confusion.
Well, the thought of McCarrick being laicized and not being excommunicated avoids a canonical process of a charge. And in my mind, maybe they just don't want to go through that process and make it all public. Mm-hmm. Again, that's fine. Well, it just avoids that. Don't want to talk about this anymore. Well, let's just laicize him. Let's not look into this anymore. Regarding Strickland, to my knowledge, I don't think he's ever had officially a charge brought against him. So I don't think you can excommunicate someone and you're not charging them with something. He was just removed from his office.
Right.
Which it just seems highly unusual with no formal reason.
And that's what I'm asking. And I'm actually asking, because I'm not a canon lawyer. I don't understand the intricacies of canon law, neither do you. Yeah. We're just two guys having a conversation.
That's right. And we might have got some of these details wrong here.
It's entirely possible. And I'm happy to be corrected if I'm mistaken. But when we talk about excommunication being medicinal. I want to understand better when and why is it the case that removal from office is more medicinal than excommunication? And if excommunication isn't warranted by what has been decided worthy of removing you from office, is removal from office a proportionate response? And if it is, and I know that some people denounce this as whataboutism, but what about when people in other equivalent offices also run amok, but to no consequence? As the father of a large family, I think you appreciate what happens if your children look around and they can't discern the manner in which you execute discipline in the family. And I just worry that there is something problematic if a growing number, even if it starts small and hasn't grown that big, but if some number of the children in the family, while looking around, begin to question and doubt the legitimacy of the discipline that is shown in the first place. I just think that's harmful.
So regarding an anti-pope, you brought that up earlier, that phrase. Can you again clarify what that is? You said it's happened a number of times throughout history. And then I would like you to address those who might be watching who believe Pope Francis is an anti-pope. Because I feel like I've noticed that sentiment growing and growing and growing in the last 7 years or so. I mean, it probably was there before, but your response to that. So,
my response is quite simply, you are incapable of judging that. Just because we perceive something does not make it an objective judgment that now dictates how I will live my life. And moreover, if you have decided that it can dictate the way in which you live your life, how exactly has it changed the way you live your life as a Catholic that you have judged Pope Francis to be an anti-pope, and in fact no pope at all? And moreover, what are the perceived steps that you have concluded are going to happen moving forward from now, since we are 2 years out from the death of who you, I assume, think to be the last reigning pope? When our conclusions open more questions than they resolve, we ought not to put ourselves into them. If you are noticing things about the way in which Pope Francis exercises his ministry that disturb you or upset you or make you question his legitimacy, I think the solution to that is stop paying such close attention. Go to Mass, say your rosary, serve the poor, be Catholic. You don't read everything that comes out from the Vatican news services if every time you do it raises your blood pressure. Chances are it has next to nothing to do with you and the way in which you live out your Catholic life. So I just think that it's detrimental to one's own peace, to say nothing of what it could do to the communion of the Church. If everybody just decides that they are the competent authority to judge something to be the truth of that magnitude.
I think the response, I could hear someone say, well, I have an obligation to seek the truth in situations, and I'm seeking the truth in this, so I'm questioning, and because that's right and just. I think that's what they would say, and I should live according to my conscience if I believe that Pope Francis is not the Pope. Then
I would ask them, and what does that mean? How has that changed your Catholic life? What are you capable of doing differently now that you have determined Pope Francis is not the Pope? Where do you go to Mass? What do you do? How do you receive the sacraments? you're arriving at that conclusion. I cannot understand how it changes what you do as a Catholic. Because you're not capable or competent of making a binding judgment on this.
Who is?
The College of Cardinals after the death of Pope Francis. If a group of cardinals rises up that says, we are the cardinals who were appointed by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, we have reason to believe that we have lived under an anti-papacy for this last number of years. We denounce the legitimacy of Cardinal Bergoglio as ever having ascended to the See of Peter. And here are our judgments, and here are our findings, and this is why we believe this is true. All other cardinals don't have a vote in this now needed conclave. I can't even imagine what would happen in the life of the church if that were to take place. That's their authority to decide that that's what's going to happen next.
I think that's...
And what am I going to do as a Catholic? I'm going to start saying a lot more rosaries, but I can't do anything about it.
I think that's the key point that I was trying to get to, because I want to just affirm that I believe, like, in case someone was misinterpreting the line of questioning, I believe Pope Francis is our legitimate Pope. But the authority of who finally makes that decision, well, it's not a layperson on YouTube with a camera.
No.
I mean, it's an opinion, but like in the life of the church, lay people don't make those determinations.
Right. And sometimes, contrary to what we would love to believe, it can be harmful to share our opinions. And there might even be some people who would think that some of the opinions that you and I have shared on YouTube in our conversations are harmful. And if they think that, I'm very open to having someone pull me aside and say, you ought not to have shared that opinion. Nothing is gained by you having had that conversation. And I think you should remove it. I would be very open to having someone say that to me. If they turn around and publish a video denouncing me and telling me that I ought not to have had that opinion, well, you ought not to have had that one. So there, we're even. You know, that's not how correction works. So I think, though, we just need to step back and ask ourselves, are all of the opinions that we espouse, do they need to be shared publicly? And is there something good to be obtained from others? Does it serve the common good?
Yeah.
And sharing every opinion, and you know that there are things you ask me that I say, Ken, I don't want to talk about that.
Yep.
Because I don't know what the value would be in my weighing in on that.
But then you will war with me privately.
Sure.
And I appreciate that. But that war that we would have doesn't need to be heard by everyone.
No.
Because it could be that my weakness would weaken someone else. It could cause more confusion. And I recognize that. I also want to say that there have been videos that we have done that we haven't released.
Yes, that's true.
Looking back at it and thinking, that it's better not. Those words are best left between us. Mm-hmm. And it's usually because of things I have said, for the record.
Oh, I'm sure I've made my own contribution. But that's what I have said before. I value about what you and I are doing, which is we happen to be publicly sharing a conversation.
Yes, yeah.
But this is what needs to happen. Ideas are worked out in conversation. And I think we both only hope that what we share of our conversations are for the sake of helping people also formulate their own ideas and understandings. But that is really only going to take full effect in your life if you then turn around and have a conversation with someone else. Firing off a comment isn't a conversation either. So we hope that these are conversation starters, that they become ways in which people can say, that prompted me. And some of the best conversations I have with my friends are based on podcasts that we've listened to or articles that we've read where I'm like, hey, read this. I want to talk about this with you next time we're together. And then we talk about it. That's how we form ourselves. And so I can only hope that our conversations do that. And if all they're doing is adding to the noise, if all they do is add to confusion or cynicism or pessimism, then then we ought not have them either.
Well, I appreciate our conversations. I hope this one goes forward.
We'll see if this one makes it.